If you want a peaceful life, you'd better move into my lakeside neighborhood, otherwise, you're in for a nightmare. That was the message she hurled over the fence that morning. At first, I thought she was being dramatica until she dialed 911, claiming I was trespasser harassing the locals. All while I stood quietly in front of the very home I'd legally purchased, fully paid, and documented. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't the kind of neighbor who folds under pressure. I didn't argue or raise my voice. I simply reached into my wallet and showed them the one thing that carried actual weight in situations like this. The shift in their attitude was immediate, gone in under 2 seconds. This place was supposed to be my sanctuary, a break from the relentless pace of city crime work. After 15 years spent tracking down killers, traffickers, and corporate cons, I thought I'd earned a little quiet. And the house? It was ideally a modest 2-bedroom cottage with a dock stretching out into Crystal Lake. The former owner, a retired professor, had kept everything in pristine shape, with detailed records for every corner of the property. When I signed the papers 3 weeks earlier, the realtor talked up the tight-knit community vibe. Oddly enough, he neglected to mention the self-declared ruler who lived just 2 doors down. That was Vivian Blackwood, though around here, most folks referred to her as Karen, for obvious reasons. I met her one calm September morning. I was sipping coffee on the back porch, watching the fog drift lazily across the lake, when I heard the sharp tap of heels crunching gravel. She rounded the side of the house like she owned the land, dressed in a spotless white blazer and clutching a sleek leather folder that probably cost more than my month's grocery bill. Her smile was all lips, no warmth, a perfect display of polished insincerity. "You must be the new neighbor," she said, offering a manicured hand. "I'm Vivian Blackwood, president of Lakefront Estates." "Welcome." I shook her hand, noting her assertive grip and the way her eyes darted across my property like a checklist was forming in her mind. What began as typical neighborly greetings soon veered into something stranger. Vivian launched into a pitch about the HOA, but it felt less like a community benefit and more like an indoctrination speech. "Living outside the association can be difficult," she said, somehow already using my name even though I'd never given it. "We pride ourselves on tight security, flawless upkeep, and most importantly, we watch out for one another." That last part came with an edge, like a warning disguised as concern. When I politely declined, mentioning I had picked this home specifically because it wasn't under HOA rule, her smile twitched but quickly recovered. That's when things started getting weird. She pulled out a tape measure and started checking the height of my lawn, mumbling about standards and property values. Despite not having jurisdiction, she insisted I should still abide by their guidelines to avoid impacting nearby home values. I stood there, stunned, as this stranger launched into a lecture about proper landscaping, preferred flower species, and the importance of a unified neighborhood aesthetic. The irony was rich. After years as a detective handling real criminals, I was now being reprimanded over my yard by a suburban tyrant. Then, while she was snapping photos of my offending plants, I noticed the wallpaper on her phone, a dignified-looking man with kind eyes and silver at his temples. "That's my late husband, Henry," she said, catching my glance. "Dr. Henry Blackwood. He passed 2 years ago." There was something strange in her tone. Stranger still was the photo. He looked healthy, vibrant, not like someone whose end was near. My instincts, sharpened by years on the force, were already buzzing. Then she blindsided me with a question. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about the Blackwood case from 2 years ago, would you?" Her eyes scanned me, watching every flicker of reaction. I shook my head. She smiled, almost too quickly. "Of course not. Why would you? It was just a terrible accident. Henry fell into the lake while fishing. Very tragic. Thankfully, there was never any cause for suspicion." That phrasing, emphasizing that nothing seemed odd, only made me more suspicious. In my line of work, when someone goes out of their way to stress that there's nothing to investigate, it usually means there's plenty to uncover. Her visit ended with a professionally designed HOA brochure and a firm reminder that community cooperation was vital. As she strutted back down the driveway, I glanced through the brochure. The promises it made were telling: security, unity, defense from unwanted disruptions. Most of the testimonials talked about feeling safe, not about events or property care. It sounded more like marketing for a private security firm than a neighborhood organization. Standing there, I couldn't shake the unease. Vivian hadn't just tried to sell me on a long policy she'd asked about a cold case, subtly warned me, and made it clear that rejecting her offer might come with strings attached. In my years of experience, I'd learned that when someone tries too hard to convince you everything's finally a broken bar, that's when you should start digging. And it was becoming clear that Mrs. Blackwood didn't just want me as an borrower, she had something else in mind. The gentle splash of lake water against the dock was interrupted by the unmistakable click of heels on gravel. Vivian was back. This time, her whole demeanor had shifted. The fake friendliness was gone, replaced with a steely, cold precision I recognized all too well. It was the same expression worn by suspects who thought they were 3 steps ahead of the game. She stormed up to the edge of my property like she was conducting a tactical operation, a clipboard in one hand, phone ready in the other. "Mr. Webb," she said, her tone sharp enough to draw blood, "I gave you a full day to reconsider my generous offer. Since you've decided to ignore the benefits of being part of our community, I'm afraid you'll now learn what that decision entails." I shut off the hose and turned to face her squarely. She stood just outside the boundary line, close enough to provoke, but just far enough to claim she hadn't crossed into my space. "Mrs. Blackwood," I said evenly, "I understand your concerns, but as I mentioned yesterday, I'm perfectly happy living the way I am. I chose this home precisely because it's not part of an HOA, and I plan to keep it that way." Her jaw clenched, and the tension in her grip around that clipboard told me just how much she hated hearing that. "You don't understand what you're getting into," she said, lowering her voice into something meant to sound like concern, but carried a clear edge of menace. "This neighborhood has standards. People who fail to meet them often find themselves in unfortunate situations. I'd hate for someone as seemingly pleasant as you to go through that." It was a veiled threat, a one that didn't surprise me. What came next, though, did. Without saying another word, she raised her phone and dialed. I watched, incredulous, as she calmly fabricated an emergency. "Yes, I need police assistance right away," she said, her voice suddenly trembling, full of manufactured panic. "There's a suspicious man in the area, taking photos and harassing neighbors." When I confronted him, he became aggressive. "I'm concerned for my safety and for the safety of others." It was a masterful performance, complete with darting glances and a just right level of false distress. A few minutes later, a patrol car arrived and pulled up in front of my place. Officer Jenny Santos stepped out, young, sharp-eyed, and all buzziness of her presence was a relief. She approached professionally, notebook in hand. "Ma'am," she said, "can you explain what happened here?" Vivian launched into her story with flair, painting me as a hostile outsider snooping through the neighborhood. Her delivery was polished and detailed, too detailed. She made it sound like I'd been stalking the area with sinister intent. I couldn't help but take mental note as she had the lying skills of a seasoned informant. Officer Santos turned her attention to me, her tone even and steady. "Sir, may I see some identification and get your version of events?" That's when I made a decision that shifted everything. Instead of handing over my license, I reached into my wallet and flipped it open, revealing my badge. The change was immediate. Her eyes widened slightly, her posture straightened. "Detective Webb," she said, clearly taken aback. "I know your name. You worked the Morrison case, didn't you? What brings you out here?" I explained that I had just purchased the home and had been quietly enjoying the morning when Vivian approached with complaints about my landscaping. Vivian's expression melted faster than ice in July. Her confidence collapsed into wide-eyed shock. For a moment, she looked completely lost, her mouth opening and closing without a word like a fish pulled from water. I could see her mind racing, trying to salvage whatever control she thought she had. "Oh dear," she finally said, her voice now sugar-sweet. "What a huge misunderstanding. I didn't realize you were law enforcement. I was just trying to ensure the safety of the neighborhood, you understand? We must have started off on the wrong foot." The pivot was laughable if it weren't so revealing. Officer Santos stepped closer to me and spoke in a quiet tone. "Detective, I should probably let you know this isn't the first time she's called something in. Over the past 6 months, she's made a dozen similar reports. Every time, it's about someone she claims might be a threat to the neighborhood." What's strange is that her descriptions always include people who seem to know too much about what goes on around here. That piece of intel hit hard. Someone who consistently reports others for knowing too much is usually guarding secrets of their own. Santos continued. Most of her claims turn out to be baseless, but we have to respond regardless. Meanwhile, Vivian had completely changed gears and was now bubbling with forced enthusiasm. Officer Santos, perhaps you could take a look at this gentleman's landscaping permits. I'm worried that his butterfly bush might trigger allergies for my darling Duchess and my Pomeranian. Community health is such a concern. Don't you agree? The question was so absurd that Santos blinked in confusion before calmly replying that residential butterfly bushes required no permits. I was almost impressed by Vivian's ability to pivot from calling me a threat to fretting over pet allergies in under 5 minutes. As Santos prepared to leave, having determined no crime had occurred beyond the possibility of a false report, Vivian made one last attempt at damage control. Detective Webb, she said with a smile so forced it looked painful. How about you come by for coffee this afternoon? I feel just awful about the misunderstanding. I'd love a chance to make things right. She mentioned we could chat over coffee to talk about how valuable someone with my background would be in a community like theirs, but the way she said it felt more like a trap than a friendly invitation, as if the spider was welcoming the fly to dinner. I nodded politely and told her I'd think about it. After they both left, I stood in my driveway, trying to make sense of what had just happened. It made no logical sense. Why would a woman so desperate to avoid police involvement go out of her way to lure a detective into her neighborhood? It was a contradiction that couldn't be ignored. Most people who file false police reports aren't looking to increase law enforcement presence. Yet here was Vivian, deliberately trying to bring me closer, despite knowing I had the skills to uncover things she might not want found. That told me one thing: she needed something from me, something significant enough that she was willing to risk exposure. The contradiction stayed with me all day. Vivian was clearly fearful of scrutiny, and yet she was actively courting it. It reminded me of a case that had haunted me for years, one where I had dismissed conflicting behavior as coincidence and missed something crucial. I'd promised myself I'd never let that happen again. This time, I'd follow my instincts, no matter how strange things seemed. By that evening, I had already shifted into investigation mode. I started with a few quiet calls to some reliable contacts in the county records department. It didn't take long to uncover some curious details about Dr. Henry Blackwood's death. Officially, he had died 2 years earlier in what was listed as an accidental drowning. The report claimed he had gone fishing on Crystal Lake alone, fallen from his boat, and died before anyone could help him. The case had been closed quickly, no evidence of foul play, and his grieving widow had seemed too fragile to endure a deeper inquiry. He'd had a life insurance policy worth nearly $2 million, and not unusual for a doctor of his standing. But when I read the medical examiner's report, things didn't add up. It lacked the usual thoroughness I'd come to expect from drowning investigations. No scene photos, no detailed breakdown of injuries. The final death certificate had been signed off by Dr. Patricia Hoffman, who, coincidentally, was listed in public records as one of Vivian's former nursing colleagues. The deeper I dug, the more cracks I found. Why would a man with years of fishing experience suddenly fall into the lake and drown on a calm, quiet night? And why wasn't his death investigated more thoroughly? Looking for more information, I visited Rodriguez Plumbing, a small, well-established business that had been doing work in the lakefront community for years. My house's maintenance records showed they'd done plumbing repairs at the Blackwood home shortly before Dr. Blackwood's death. I was greeted by Billy Tank Rodriguez, the owner's son. Broad-shouldered and rough-handed, he had the kind of straightforward manner that made people open up without even realizing it. I told him I was the new homeowner, digging into some property history. He didn't hesitate. "Oh yeah, the Blackwood job," he said, shaking his head. "That was a strange one. We spent 3 days fixing a burst pipe in the basement, and the whole time, Mrs. Blackwood kept hovering. She kept asking if we could hear anything from the upper floor, said she was worried about privacy. It was weird." He paused, wiping his hands on the rag. "The night before the doctor died, I had to swing by to finish some paperwork. That's when I heard Ida a screaming match. real intense. The kind of argument that makes you consider calling the police. She was yelling about not being left with nothing. He was shouting back about not being able to live with lies anymore. Then, just like that, silence. Tank said he knocked on the door, and when Vivian answered, she was calm, collected, like nothing had happened. She paid him in cash and asked him not to tell anyone about the fight. It would be too embarrassing, she said. The timing was too perfect to ignore. A violent argument one night, and a sudden, accidental death the next. But Tank wasn't finished. "There's one more thing that never sat right with me," he said, pulling out his phone. "I record a lot of my work for insurance purposes. Just happened to be filming near the dock while I was testing the outdoor spigot." He showed me a video with a timestamp placing it just a couple of hours before Dr. Blackwood's reported time of death. In the footage, a figure could be seen being shoved off the dock into the lake, but instead of panicking or sinking, the person calmly resurfaced and began swimming toward the opposite shore, disappearing into the trees. "I never knew what to make of it," Tank admitted. "She seemed heartbroken when they found his empty boat. Everyone said it was an accident, but after watching this, it doesn't look like he drowned. Not even close." I asked him if he'd ever taken it to the police. He hesitated. "By the time I realized what I had, the case was already closed. And honestly, Mrs. Blackwood was always good to our family, gave us plenty of work. I didn't want to stir up trouble with something that might not even mean anything." Driving home, my mind was reeling. If the man in the video really was Dr. Blackwood, then two possibilities emerged. Either someone tried to kill him and he managed to escape, or he staged the whole thing himself. In either case, one thing was becoming increasingly clear: Vivian Blackwood was at the center of something far more sinister than I had first suspected. Vivian had made repeated efforts to attract law enforcement officers to the neighborhood, and if you were planning to orchestrate the perfect crime, what better shield than having police as neighbors who could later swear that nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary? Back at my house, I found an email from Vivian sitting in my inbox. The subject line read, "Property Compliance Violation Notice." The content was a masterclass in passive-aggressive authoritarianism. She accused me of parking my car at a 2-degree angle from the curb, violating the HOA's aesthetic guidelines. The message came complete with exact measurements, time-stamped photos, and a formal warning that I could face daily fines of up to $500 until the infraction was corrected. That level of compulsive detail didn't just point to someone obsessed with control, it confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. Vivian hadn't invited me into her community just to nitpick my lawn or criticize my parking. She needed me there for something far more calculated. She was trying to curate her image. And what better way than having a respected detective as her neighbor to vouch for her innocence and reinforce the idea that she was simply a grieving widow preserving community order. Vivian wasn't building a homeowners association as she was building a defense. And if Tank's footage was accurate and Dr. Blackwood was still alive, this wasn't just a case of insurance fraud. Something much darker was unfolding. Her plan was disturbingly sophisticated. By recruiting me into her neighborhood, she was crafting a future witness when the time came, either when Henry's body conveniently turned up or if she decided to make the fake death a reality, she'd have someone credible living next door to back her story. A respected former detective, unwittingly testifying to her innocence. The more I unraveled her approach, the more I had to admire its precision. She deliberately presented herself as an overzealous HOA president, as someone so fixated on trivial issues like lawn edging and parking symmetry that people saw her as annoying but ultimately harmless. That persona was her camouflage. No one would suspect someone so petty of being capable of murder. Even local law enforcement saw her as little more than an obsessive neighborhood nuisance. That perception meant any future complaints against her were likely to be dismissed before they even began. But what Vivian didn't factor in was that manipulating a former detective isn't a low-risk move. Just 2 days after speaking with Tank, I received a certified envelope from a law firm I'd never heard of, Morrison Kellner and Associates. Inside was a lawsuit. Vivian was suing me for $50,000, claiming emotional trauma and property damage caused by my alleged harassment and threatening behavior. The allegations painted me as a rogue, stalking residents, snapping unauthorized photos, and making unsettling remarks about neighborhood security. Of course, This wasn't about legal damages. Vivian was trying to tarnish my credibility and discredit me before I could blow the whistle. She even began spreading stories among the residents, painting me as a disgraced cop who had been forced into early retirement over unresolved psychological issues and botched high-profile cases. She had clearly done her research enough truth to make the fabrications seem plausible. It was a calculated move to neutralize any threat I posed by making me appear unstable. What Vivian failed to realize, however, was that while she was busy attacking my character, I was collecting evidence. I had already installed an advanced surveillance system on my property, discrete cameras with near-invisible visibility. But even more interesting was a discovery I made about the smart speaker that came pre-installed in the home. It had been set up to sync with other smart devices in the area, including one that had been covertly placed on my property without my consent. Through some digital sleight of hand that might not withstand federal scrutiny, I managed to access feeds from Vivian's own network of surveillance devices. What I found changed everything. One recording captured a phone conversation between Vivian and someone named Patricia, presumably Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the same person who had signed off on Dr. Blackwood's death certificate. "The detective is asking too many questions," Vivian said. "We might have to push up the timeline. Henry can't stay hidden forever. If he gets caught before we're ready, everything falls apart." That single exchange proved Dr. Blackwood was alive. His death had been fabricated, and Vivian wasn't done with whatever twisted scheme she'd started. But what really chilled me was a separate recording from the night before. Vivian was pacing inside her home, speaking to herself aloud. "He thinks he's clever, snooping around where he doesn't belong," she said, seething. "But he has no idea what I've sacrificed to get this far. I won't let some washed-up detective destroy everything. If he keeps pushing, he'll learn just how far I'm willing to go to protect my secrets." Her voice was tight with rage. In that moment, all doubt evaporated. This woman was capable of far more than deception. She was dangerous. Then came the twist. The law firm that had filed the lawsuit on her behalf, Morrison Kellner and Associates, abruptly dropped the case. No explanation, no press release, just gone. I had a quiet word with one of the senior partners, hinting at my suspicions about their client's involvement in a complex insurance fraud scheme, possibly more. That was all it took. Filing false police reports seemed to be the final straw for those still willing to associate with Mrs. Blackwood. Within hours of the law firm's withdrawal, I got a panicked call from Vivian herself, suddenly eager to resolve our differences like civilized neighbors. But her most absurd move came next. She lodged a formal noise complaint with the county's environmental authority. According to her, my so-called excessive vocalization during my morning hygiene routine was disrupting the peace of the neighborhood and violating local noise control regulations. In plain English, she was trying to get me fined for singing in the shower at 7 in the morning. The complaint was bizarrely elaborate, a 3-page breakdown of allowable decibel levels by time of day, a proposed singing schedule with specific vocal limits, and a strong recommendation that I install soundproofing in my bathroom out of respect for the neighborhood's acoustic sensitivity. On the surface, it was laughable, but beneath the comedy was a clever strategy. Vivian was laying down a trail of documented grievances, no matter how petty, in hopes of painting me as an unreasonable, unstable neighbor. That way, if I ever made serious accusations, she could discredit me as just another troublemaker obsessed with minor disputes. After all, who would believe that someone complaining about shower singing could be orchestrating insurance fraud and plotting murder? It was a psychological battle masked as bureaucratic nitpicking, and as much as I hated to admit it, it was an effective tactic. Still, Vivian had made a critical misjudgment as she underestimated what a seasoned detective, armed with motive and experience, could accomplish. While she waged her war through paperwork and gossip, I was quietly assembling a case that would expose not just her deception, but the entire web of criminal activity she had built around herself. She thought we were playing different game as a chess and checkers, but she was about to learn that sometimes the person who appears to be losing is actually setting up for checkmate. The recordings captured by the smart speaker were enough to establish a solid claim of insurance fraud. But I knew that wouldn't be enough to stop Vivian if her plans were shifting toward actual murder. The intercepted calls made it clear. Dr. Blackwood was alive, but in serious danger. Vivian had spoken of making it more convincing this time, hinting that she planned to replace the fake drowning with a real body. Using the audio files Tank had secured, along with new data recovered from Vivian's compromised smart devices, I started piecing together the full extent of her operation. It wasn't just one fraudulent death. Vivian had built an elaborate network involving at least 3 complicit medical professionals and 2 major insurance companies. This wasn't suburban mischief, it was a well-oiled criminal enterprise disguised as neighborhood management. The most unsettling discovery came when I dug through her past residence history. At 2 previous addresses, I found records of accidental deaths involving husbands. Both incidents resulted in sizable life insurance claims. Officer Santos had been working quietly behind the scenes with me. When I shared my findings with her, her reaction was swift and decisive. "Detective Webb," she said, "this goes way beyond HOA drama. We're talking about potential serial homicide, insurance scams, and a deep conspiracy. If Dr. Blackwood is still alive, we have to reach him before she makes her next move." She was right, but tracking down a man who'd successfully stayed hidden for 2 years wouldn't be easy, especially when the person trying to eliminate him had near limitless resources and an embedded network of accomplices. The break we needed came from a surprising place. While reviewing property deeds in the area, I discovered Vivian owned a cabin about 15 miles up the lake. It had been purchased just a few months after her husband's death and was listed as a seasonal retreat. The timing raised serious red flags. I drove up to investigate. Fresh tire tracks led to the cabin, and the place looked lived in. Its remote location made it an ideal spot to hide someone you needed to keep under control but alive. Approaching carefully, I called out from a safe distance, identifying myself as a former detective investigating Vivian's actions. I didn't know if I'd find Henry or walk into a trap. Then a voice responded, shaky and terrified, "Please don't let her know you found me. If she thinks I've talked to someone, she'll really kill me this time." Dr. Henry Blackwood emerged alive, but deeply traumatized. His body was intact, but his spirit had been worn thin by years of fear and isolation. As he began recounting his story, the scope of Vivian's crimes came into sharper focus. She hadn't merely staged his death. 4 months before it, she had slowly been poisoning him using her medical knowledge to simulate symptoms that would explain an accidental passing. He only uncovered her plan when he found the poison hidden in their medicine cabinet, realizing his fatigue and confusion weren't due to stress or age. "She's not just manipulative," Henry said, his hands trembling as he poured a cup of coffee. "She's perfected this. I found evidence she did the same thing to at least 2 other husbands. Always made it look like an accident." When he confronted her, she didn't deny a thing. Instead, she gave him 2 choices: vanish quietly and let her cash in on his life, or die for real in a very public and painful way. Faced with that, faking his death seemed like the lesser evil. But Henry wasn't just a victim, he was also a trained forensic pathologist, and he had far more to offer than his testimony. Henry had been quietly compiling evidence against Vivian long before his staged death, meticulously documenting her actions and building a case strong enough to put her away for good. "I knew even if I disappeared, someone else would eventually end up dead if she wasn't stopped," he told me as he opened a neatly labeled file box. "I've been collecting proof for 2 years, waiting for the right moment to go public. When Santos told me a detective had moved in and started asking the right questions, I realized the time had come." The bitter irony wasn't lost on me. Vivian's attempt to manipulate me into becoming her pawn had, in fact, triggered the sequence that would lead to her undoing. The materials Henry had amassed were damning. There were medical reports detailing the subtle, progressive poisoning, financial records showing the payouts from fraudulent life insurance claims, and most chilling of all, audio clips of Vivian talking about her previous murders with the nonchalance most people reserve for a grocery list. She had documented every step of her process, as if her criminal precision were something to be admired. "She believes she's invincible," Henry said, his voice steady, "but her arrogance will be her downfall." As we mapped out our strategy, Vivian delivered yet another reminder of her obsessive need to dominate every corner of her environment. I received an email from her, this time accusing me of destabilizing the neighborhood's power grid. According to her calculations, My use of electricity between 6 p.m. and 11 p.m. was putting undue strain on community infrastructure. She insisted I reduce usage to a maximum of 3 hours per day to promote sustainable practices. Attached were colorful charts, consumption graphs, and a suggested schedule for when I'd be permitted to use certain appliances. There was a surreal absurdity to it all, being lectured about light bulbs by someone plotting murder. Vivian was filing formal noise complaints about my morning routine while planning to take a life. Either she had completely lost her grip on reality, or she was so confident in her ability to manipulate the system that she truly believed she could murder people while preserving her image as a model community leader. Still, getting a man legally declared dead to resurface and testify against his would-be killer wasn't going to be simple. It would take more than airtight evidence. It would take courage. Henry would have to face the woman who had terrorized him in open court, knowing that his testimony could either end her reign or put him back in danger if she somehow managed to evade justice again. What we devised was risky, but necessary. Our plan was to push Vivian into a public confrontation, the one she couldn't flee or control. I would host a neighborhood barbecue under the guise of repairing tensions and proving I wanted to be a better neighbor. Everyone from the Lake community would be invited, including Officer Santos and several off-duty officers posing as personal guests. The objective was to lull Vivian into a false sense of victory, all while setting the stage for her reckoning. The invitation I sent was a carefully crafted performance of humility and goodwill. I apologized profusely for any misunderstandings, praised her relentless commitment to community excellence, and expressed how much I'd learned from her suggestions about property upkeep and sound etiquette. Vivian's reply came almost instantly. She was thrilled and convinced that I had finally submitted to her authority. She saw it as her personal triumph over the so-called rogue neighbor who had dared to challenge her dominance. On the day of the event, Santos and her team took strategic positions around my property while Henry stayed out of sight at the cabin, listening in through a secure radio link. He would make his entrance precisely when the crowd was largest and Vivian was most confident. Until that moment, my role was to play the part of the reformed, obedient neighbor while Santos's team gathered what they needed from Vivian's home under the pretense of social mingling. Vivian arrived in full regalia, dressed as though she were attending a charity garden gala rather than a backyard gathering. She moved through the crowd like a queen at a victory parade, accepting compliments and subtle nods of respect from residents who praised her for turning the new guy around. Her performance was seamless, her charisma dialed up, her manipulations invisible to most. As the conversation shifted to neighborhood safety and community trust, several attendees mentioned how reassured they felt knowing Vivian was always vigilant. She soaked in their admiration while casually referencing the recent unfortunate disturbances that had required her to step in. When someone expressed sympathy over the hardships she'd endured while grieving her late husband, Vivian's expression softened into a mask of graceful sorrow. "Henry would have been so proud of how we all came together," she said, her voice delicately tinged with emotion. That was my cue. I got to my feet, smiling as I addressed the crowd. "Please, everyone, keep enjoying yourselves. I have something special planned, a little surprise that I hope will bring the community even closer." There was a ripple of excitement. Vivian lit up, clearly expecting another moment of praise to bask in, but when I returned to the yard moments later, I wasn't alone. Dr. Henry Blackwood was with me. Blackwood walked beside me, unmistakably the man from the framed photos lining Vivian's walls. Only now, his features bore the wear of 2 years spent in hiding a gaunt shadow of the life he'd been forced to abandon. The effect on the crowd was immediate and electric. Conversations froze mid-word, glasses slipped from hands, and several gasps pierced the silence. But no one reacted like Vivian. All color drained from her face as if someone had flipped a switch. Her mouth opened, then closed again, silently flailing like someone drowning in air. "Hello, Vivian," Henry said softly, his voice slicing through the stunned silence. "I think we need to talk about what really happened that night at the lake." It was as if the words struck her physically. I watched the careful illusions she'd curated for 2 decades disintegrate before our eyes. She tried to summon words, tried to pull herself together, but she couldn't. Seeing her dead husband alive in front of a yard full of witnesses shattered even her finely tuned mask of composure. The crowd, moments ago singing her praises, now stared with shock and growing dread as Henry began to speak. Calmly, he explained how Vivian had spent months subtly poisoning him, how she orchestrated his staged death to collect life insurance money, and how she had threatened to finish the job if he ever spoke up. Those who had admired her just minutes ago now recoiled, some instinctively stepping back, as though proximity alone might be dangerous. But Vivian's unraveling was just beginning. As the truth sank in, she began muttering first to herself, then to anyone who would listen. "Noah Broken Bar, this can't be happening," she whispered, eyes locked on Henry in terror. "You're supposed to be dead. I made sure you were dead. Everything was perfect." A Broken Bar, her voice grew louder, desperate. "He's not real. This is a setup. I've been collecting his life insurance for 2 years. The confession that followed was as disturbing as it was pitiful. Surrounded by stunned neighbors and off-duty officers capturing everything, Vivian began listing the steps she took to fake Henry's death. She talked about researching drowning patterns, bribing medical professionals, fabricating documents, calculating policies, and creating alibis. She confessed like someone reciting a recipe, clinical, methodical. Then came the most chilling admission of all. Henry wasn't her first. She'd refined the entire process through earlier marriages in other states. That was the breaking point. Santos stepped forward and placed her under arrest, charging her with conspiracy, fraud, and attempted murder. But even as she was read her rights, Vivian spiraled deeper into delusion, denying everything one moment, then offering new details the next. While being handcuffed, she turned to me and said with perfect seriousness, "Detective Webb, your lawn still exceeds HOA height restrictions by at least 3 inches. That needs immediate correction." The comment was so wildly out of place that a few onlookers laughed, despite the horror of what had just unfolded. But it was a fitting display of her fractured mind, a woman who could murder without remorse but obsess over lawn care violations like they were capital crimes. Even in custody, knowing her crimes were fully exposed, Vivian couldn't stop trying to enforce community guidelines. As Santos led her away, she shouted complaints with equal outrage about her innocence and my supposed violations of landscaping protocol. "This is all a misunderstanding," she called out, "and someone needs to fix the parking problem on this block before it tanks our property values." Her final words before being placed into the patrol car were a demand that someone check my outdoor lighting hours for energy efficiency compliance. But even as she was driven off, I knew it wasn't truly over. A woman who had gotten away with murder more than once wouldn't surrender easily. She still had resources, allies, and a high-powered attorney who would argue Henry's reappearance was a hoax, that everything had been a fabrication. The real fight had just begun and the battlefield was shifting to the courtroom. Vivian had hired one of the most expensive criminal defense lawyers in the state, Richard Sterling. Known for turning criminals into sympathetic victims, his defense was both expected and calculated. He painted Henry as unstable, claiming he faked his own death to escape mounting debts, only to return with a forged paper trail to frame Vivian. In Sterling's version of the story, I was nothing more than a disgraced ex-detective grasping at one final, flashy case to restore a broken career. What Sterling hadn't accounted for was Judge Patricia Moore. From the moment proceedings began, she issued a statement that sent a jolt through the defense table. "Let the record reflect," she said, "that I presided over a prior case involving Mrs. Blackwood approximately a decade ago, when she worked as a psychiatric nurse and faced allegations of patient abuse. The charges had been dismissed then, due to lack of evidence, but Moore made it clear she'd kept tabs on Vivian ever since, watching quietly for the full scope of her wrongdoing to emerge. The revelation that a sitting judge had been monitoring Vivian's behavior for years shattered the defense's portrayal of her as a grieving, falsely accused widow. And the trial was just getting started. Authorities from multiple states had already been monitoring Vivian's movements, investigating the suspicious deaths of her former husbands. "This court has been assembling a case against Mrs. Blackwood for quite some time," Judge Moore announced. "Detective Webb's findings simply completed the puzzle, giving us what we needed to move forward with prosecution." Henry's account was devastating and vivid. He described, with startling clarity, how Vivian had used her background in medicine to slowly poison him, choosing substances that would mimic age-related illnesses and gradually wear down his body. Her plan was calculated: weaken him just enough that his eventual drowning would pass as a tragic accident, not a crime. He'd only discovered her intent by chance, spotting the poison tucked behind other medications in their cabinet. That was when he realized his decline wasn't natural, it was orchestrated. "She didn't just want me gone," he told the silent courtroom. "She wanted to watch me crumble. She wanted to see me suffer and fail to understand why I was dying, all while pretending to be my devoted wife." When he spoke of the night she shoved him off the dock, convinced he was too frail to swim back, his voice wavered. But he hadn't drowned. He'd fought through the pain, made it to shore, and vanished into the forest alive, but forever changed. The prosecution's case became undeniable once it was revealed that Vivian had employed the exact same tactics to eliminate 2 other husbands in different states. A clear, chilling pattern emerged. She would marry elderly men with substantial assets, slowly poison them while playing the caregiver, and then arrange their deaths to appear natural. Each time, she cashed out large life insurance policies and relocated to start fresh. Her 15-year killing spree might have continued indefinitely had Henry not survived and had I not stumbled into her web. But the evidence that sealed her fate came from her own voice. The audio recordings retrieved from her hacked smart speaker were played aloud in court. In one, she casually discussed murder strategies with unsettling ease. "You make them trust you first," she said, "then weaken them, then finish them off. Simple." She added, "Widows don't get questioned when the death looks clean." Insurance companies barely blink. The defense tried to dismiss the recordings, arguing they were obtained unlawfully and should be excluded. But Judge Moore shut that down. "The devices had been placed on my property without consent of Vivian, had no right to privacy over illegal surveillance tools she had planted herself." When sentencing day arrived, Vivian made one last effort to twist the narrative. She stood in court and delivered an incoherent speech portraying herself as the real victim, blaming ungrateful husbands for leaving her vulnerable. "I gave those men everything," she said. "If they had just appreciated me, none of this would have happened." In doing so, she accidentally admitted to everything, framing it as a noble act of self-preservation. Her delusions didn't end there. During a short recess, she approached me and handed over a handwritten list of supposed violations she'd noticed in the courthouse parking area. Offenses included misaligned parking and inconsistent spacing between vehicles. She signed the note, "Vivian Blackwood, HOA Standards Enforcement," as if she still held some authority over municipal order. The verdict was swift and unforgiving: life imprisonment without parole. She was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder, numerous instances of insurance fraud, and conspiracy charges spanning across 3 states and over a decade. As she was escorted out in chains, she barked one last complaint about the height of the grass outside the courthouse and demanded to speak with the official responsible for groundskeeping. Half a year later, I received a forwarded letter from the state penitentiary. Even behind maximum security walls, Vivian remained committed to micromanagement. She had filed formal grievances regarding the poor upkeep of the prison's recreational yard and requested a meeting with correctional HOA leadership. She even submitted a proposed outline for improving inmate housing through enhanced community standards and convinced 3 cellmates to co-sign a petition for better lawn maintenance in the exercise area. As for Henry and me, we kept our promise. Together, we dove into unsolved cases, and in our first year, closed 12 cold murder files. His scientific precision and my investigative instincts made a powerful team. More importantly, Henry began to reclaim a sense of purpose. Helping grieving families find answers gave him the strength to begin healing from the horrors Vivian had inflicted. Sometimes the best thing you can do for a toxic neighbor is give them a new address complete with bars, mandatory meal plans, and no say whatsoever in lawn regulations. If they want to rant about grass height in a place where nobody's listening, well, maybe that's exactly the justice they deserve. We've all felt the dread of facing someone who tries to silence us with fear, be it a tyrannical HOA president, an overbearing boss, or a cunning manipulator. They count on our isolation and silence. But Marcus taught us something vital. Even the one who seems powerless might be collecting every shred of evidence to bring down the entire house of lies. Your story of standing up matters too. And if this taste of poetic justice hit the spot, Be sure to like and subscribe to Toja Stories, where karma always finds a way to catch up.